Although the Declaration of Independence states that all men are created equal, African Americans were fed up with their unfair treatment. Because of this, the 1950s started the Civil Rights Movement. In 1950, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People decided to challenge segregation in public schools. In 1952, the NAACP filed 5 separate lawsuits in Topeka, Kansas, Clarendon County, South Carolina, Prince Edward County, Virginia, Washington, D.C., and Wilmington, Delaware. This case became known as Brown v. the Board of Education. In June of 1953, the Supreme Court questioned both sides, and a year and a half later, they anonymously ended racial segregation in public schools. Once the Supreme Court decided separation was not equal, the NAACP wanted to continue fighting for the equality of African Americans. Between 1955 and 1957, segregation was being challenged again through the termination of the Jim Crow laws. Public golf courses, beaches, swimming pools, and transportation were the first in a series of rulings. Public transportation was affected because of the Montgomery bus boycott. The Montgomery bus boycott started on December 1, 1955, when Rosa Parks was riding the bus home after work. When the bus failed, she was instructed to stand in the back, but she refused to get up. The police were called in, and she was arrested for violating a segregation ordinance. The NAACP fought back by boycotting the bus for 382 days, which was organized by Joanne Robinson and Ella Baker. After the success of the boycott, the NAACP wanted to continue to desegregate all public and private areas. This consisted of department stores, schools, parks, libraries, hospitals, restaurants, and movie theaters. This fight for desegregation influenced President Kennedy's decision in 1963 to outlaw segregation in all public areas. This ultimately sped up school desegregation and made it easier for blacks to register to vote. After Kennedy's assassination, Martin Luther King Jr. stepped up to be the leader of African Americans. On August 28, 1963, he made his famous 17-minute I Have a Dream speech at the Lincoln Memorial during the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Even though many people believed in his message, some resisted change. On April 4, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on his balcony by James Earl Ray. However, throughout King's lifetime, he was always inspiring change. The Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, and it regulated desegregation and also included the protection against discrimination. Soon after, in 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed. This act outlawed literacy tests, poll taxes, educational requirements, and grandfather clauses when it came to African Americans voting. Then in the 1970s, affirmative action became present. This was a way for the federal government to correct past discrimination. Affirmative action was mostly for employment and education and was supported by the majority of blacks and opposed by the majority of whites. This was because it favored minorities. Even though the government was progressing with making rights more equal, there were still hate groups such as the Ku Klux Klan. At the beginning of the 70s, the KKK was engaged with cross burnings and anti-black rhetoric, but had little violence. By the early 80s, there were many cases of lynchings and violations of civil rights. Many members of the KKK were then sent to jail because of the new laws set in place. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, there is no longer segregation present. However, African American jobs and income was not equal to those of whites. Wage distribution grew even more unequal, especially with older African Americans, since they did not have a college education and only had the opportunity to get low-paying jobs. These differences between African Americans and whites created huge gaps in terms of income, unemployment, wealth, and even life expectancy. Over the years, African Americans have been gaining more and more recognition and equality in our society. In 2004, Carol Mosley Braun was one of the first African Americans who ran for president. This shows that there are no longer restrictions on African Americans and that our society accepts them. Also in 2008, Barack Obama was the first African American to get elected as President of the United States. African Americans have come a very long way to gain equal rights as whites in this country. They have had to fight for equal freedom, and today African Americans make up a predominant part of our society.